So, so now I turn to today's guest speaker, which is we're pleased to have, and that's a graduate student or finishing, perhaps, maybe you have finished. I'm not sure exactly where you are, but you have been a graduate student in the anthropology department, Sara Eriksson, and she is currently a Heinz Heinen Fellow in the Bonn Center for Slavery and Dependency Studies in Bonn, Germany, where she's completing the writing of her dissertation. Well, that answers it. You're still working on your dissertation. Soon to be done, I'm sure. Sara joined the anthropology graduate program in 2020, and her focus has been on classical archaeology in sites across the ancient world, but her real focus and interest is in classical Greece. And we'll see that today in her title. Her work at Kalaureia, Poros, Greece, I'm sure I said that name wrong, I'm so sorry, Erica, at the Sanctuary of Neptune, so she does have work in Greece at the Sanctuary of Neptune, has developed an innovative and exciting approach to rendering visible the social and economic relationships that marked enslavement in the ancient world, so the materialization of it. This will be really engaging to learn about. She will be discussing today that work in her presentation, The Itinerary of a Lead Repair, or How to Do Archaeology of Slavery in Ancient Greece. So welcome one and all, and thank you so much, Sara, for talking to us.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you all for coming to listen. It's great to see there's several familiar names and faces. All right, I'll start sharing my PowerPoint. Let me see if I get that going. How does it look? Just need to make it. Yes. So yes, and I am a grad student in the department. I'm about to finish, though. I will be filing this spring, so I'm talking today about my dissertation work, or part of it. The Itinerary of a Lead Repair, or How to Do an Archaeology of Slavery in Ancient Greece. When you excavate an ancient Greek site, there are moments that punctuate the daily grind of troweling, picking out finds, shoveling soil into wheelbarrows, and carting it to the dump pile, before you go back to the trench and do it all over again. One such puncture is the moment you pick something out of the soil and it's heavy. It's much heavier than it should be. It awakens your brain and stops you from just chucking it in the find bucket while you reach for the next find. After the first time this happens to you in the field, you also immediately know what this is. You have come across a piece of lead. This realization then leads to further disruption of the regular digging process. It's not a large-scale disruption, but it's enough that it gives the material category its own character. If you're digging without gloves, which I usually am, you immediately let go of the piece. Instead, you pick it up with your trowel and place it in a find bag rather than putting it with the rest of the finds. If it's a plastic bag, which again, usually it is today, you poke a couple of holes in the bag to stop moisture from collecting. If you touch the lead with your bare hands, you use whatever means available, even if it's just dusting your hands off on your pants, to clean off the feeling of the lead from your hands before you continue digging. Because part of the power of lead to disrupt the flow of excavation is the fact that it's toxic to humans. Lead is also the material that I will be talking about today, to start with in the shape of repairs on ceramic pots. As an archaeologist who works in ancient Greece, one of the most common questions I get is how we can see the enslaved population in the archaeological record. With today's talk, I suggest one way to answer this question, because while I dig up the lead I find in the field out of my free will, the lead that in Hellenistic Greece went into repairing pots was mined primarily by enslaved workers. I will use my lead repairs as an example of how we can rediscover the lives of these workers and center the role they played in the ancient Greek society. This work on lead is part of my PhD thesis on how unfree labor can be rendered visible in the archaeological record. The starting point for this dissertation is an assemblage from the archaeological site known as the Sanctuary of Poseidon at ancient Kalaureia, located on the modern island of Poros in Greece. The island is situated in the Saronic Gulf, about 60 kilometers southwest of Athens, and it's only separated from the Peloponnese mainland by a 200-meter wide strait. The sanctuary, which would have consisted of a temple, several stoas, so kind of buildings fulfilling several functions in the sanctuary, and the surrounding town, lies on a partly man-made plateau about 200 meters above the sea level. We have evidence of the site being inhabited from the 12th century BCE until at least the 2nd century CE. And as you see, you can kind of understand why somebody would want to settle this place. It's a very beautiful site. I feel very lucky that I've gotten to work there. The assemblage that I study was found in 2003 as part of an archaeological project led by the Swedish Institute at Athens. The excavation of a small area just outside the sanctuary proper, so if you can see my arrow about here, yielded an unusually large amount of finds, even for Greece. There's pottery, terracotta objects such as lamps and loom weights, there's animal bones, mollusks, charred seeds and charcoal, as well as metal objects, including coins. Based on the ceramics, the deposit has been dated to the second half of the 2nd century BCE. I suggest that if you just look at them from the right angle, each of these find categories can be used to discuss different aspects of enslavement in the ancient Greek world. Rather than only focusing on the discrete object and attempting to tie it to individual enslaved lives, I look at the different materials that make up the object. Drawing on the work of the science and technology scholar and feminist physicist Karen Barad, I see that the materials are in a constant state of flux. They are moving through time and space and only temporarily congealing together in different combinations, one of which is as the object I study. By tracing the flow of these materials backwards in a series of object itineraries, as conceptualized by the anthropological archaeologists Rosemary Joyce and Susan Gillespie, I can think through the actions that created this specific congealment, and the enslaved and free human and non-human agents that might have contributed to these actions. Bridging the gap between anthropological and classical archaeology, my work puts new materialist theorization in conversation with approaches developed in studies of transatlantic slavery. Although Hellenistic Greece represent a very different temporality, theories of mattering and racialization provide tools for understanding how some groups become constructed as less than human, and therefore come to occupy spaces of inequality. Black feminist thought, including Crenshaw's concept of intersectionality, show how these spaces are differentially experienced depending on factors such as gender, skill, age, and ethnicity. So, having contextualized today's topic a bit, we can now return to lead. Among the ceramic fragments in the assemblage from Kalaureia are some that come from pots that were repaired with lead. These repairs are examples of one of the most common types of lead finds on Greek excavations. They're small, flat pieces of lead, usually about 3 to 5 centimeters long and about 1 centimeter wide. Sometimes they have a round prong or two on one side, and sometimes, as you see here, they're still attached to pottery sherds. They show up in contexts ranging all across antiquity and all over the Mediterranean world. Ancient price data indicate that lead would have been a relatively cheap material compared to other metals, and it was used in a wide variety of ways. Lead was used as a construction material in water pipes, as a pigment in, for example, makeup, and of course to mend broken pots, such as the examples you see here. These are fragments of a plainware vessel, a fineware vessel, and a cooking vessel, all mended with strips of lead. The low melting point of lead, 621.5 degrees Fahrenheit, I'm very proud that I remembered to change this to Fahrenheit, made it the only one of the metals available to the ancient Greeks that could be melted in a normal house fire. So while mending something as fragile as a broken ceramic pot or other vessel would certainly have taken skill, it was something that could have been done in the place where the pot broke without access to specialist tools or a furnace. In the ancient Mediterranean, there were two main sources of lead. The large Greek mining district called Laurion, south of Athens, so here on Attica, and the Roman Rio Tinto mines in Spain, which you see circled here. I cannot say for sure which one of these mines or other, there's also lead findings on Sicily and in today's Sardinia and in today's Turkey. So I cannot say for sure which mine the lead used to mend pots on Poros originally came from, but it's likely that they contain lead from several different places, as reusing metal was very common. For the purpose of this talk, however, I will assume that most of it came from the Laurian mines, since they're considerably close geographically. So Poros is so small that it doesn't show up on this map, but it's here and here's Laurion. There's just about 60 kilometers in between. But I will also bring in supporting evidence from other ancient mining districts. There's no sources of lead on Poros, so the lead that was found on the island would have had to be transported there, either in the form of processed metallic lead or as part of an already repaired pot. And we do have evidence that both of these things were done. In the dissertation, I dedicate chapters to both the process of repairing ceramic vessels and the transportation of lead. But in this talk, I will focus on what will be my last chapter, the mining of the lead ore. So today, I will restrict myself to just drawing a straight line from Poros to Laurion. For those of you who are familiar with ancient Greek history, you might be a bit confused at the moment. While you know about the Laurion mines, you probably primarily think of them as silver mines, and they were silver mines, but not just. The Laurion mining district is part of the Attic-Cladic belt, a layered geological formation consisting of marbles and mica schists. Where these two types of stone meet, mineral-bearing ores are formed. One such ore is galena, which is one of the most important ores that was mined for lead and silver in antiquity. That these geological circumstances came together in an area just south of the major ancient city, Athens, was one part of the equation that made the Laurion mines so large. Another part was that the area possessed the geographical characteristics that made large-scale exploitation of the galena ore possible. The area has very little arable land, which made agriculture difficult, but it's also not as mountainous as other parts of Greece, allowing for a dense network of roads connecting mines and facilitating transport. Torikos, which is the main town in the district, is strategically located with access to the sea through a double bay harbor, allowing for trade of the metals produced through the mining operations. Today's research on the ancient mining in the area tend to focus primarily on the silver extracted from these mines, mentioning the lead just as a byproduct. But one could also say that it is the silver that is the byproduct of lead mining, because with the Laurion galena, you need 400 parts of lead to get 1 part silver. The earliest traces of mining in the area date to the 3rd millennium BCE and consist of horizontal cuts into the bedrock where miners in the Bronze Age chased superficial veins of ore. But by the time we get to the classical and Hellenistic period, so the 5th century BCE onwards, the miners were following much deeper veins, and centuries of mining had resulted in a vast system of underground tunnels and galleries that were reached through vertical shafts, with some going as far down as 100 meters. The miners had also reached the richest contact zone, and it was the silver that was won from the galena in this zone that fueled the booming economy of classical Athens. The third part of the equation that created this mining district was the fact that ancient Greece was a society that ran on enslaved labor, with mining being one of the main areas where forced labor was used. The number of shafts and tunnels in Laurion, the size of the slag heaps, and the riches of classical Athens all speak to the scale of the mining operations and the amount of labor that would have been needed. So who were all these people working in the Laurion mining industry? The demography of the ancient Mediterranean is notoriously difficult to calculate, but it is estimated that the enslaved workforce in Laurion would have consisted of up to 30,000 people in the 5th and 4th century BCE. It's the time that we have the best data from. A handful of literary sources give some guidance as to the scale we are talking about. According to the Athenian historian and general Thucydides, lived 460 to 400 BCE, more than 20,000 enslaved people fled from Athenian territory during the Peloponnesian War and joined the Spartan enemy. Thucydides specifies that many of these enslaved workers were handicraftsmen or artisans. Considering the specialized skills that each step of the mining process would have required, and the fact that mining was the most dominant industry in the area, the numbers can be assumed to have been partly, if not mostly, made up of enslaved mine workers. Also speaking to the amount of labor performed in the Laurion mines is the sheer volume of ore that was extracted. It has been estimated that a total of 13 million metric tons of ore were extracted in the Laurion area across antiquity. The mines were owned by the Athenian state, but leased out to private citizens, who were then responsible for financing and setting up their own mining operations. Contrary to other areas of ancient Greek society where free metic, so that is free foreigners residing in Athens, and enslaved people often worked side by side doing similar tasks, the mines seem to have been primarily run with enslaved labor. Slave owners renting out enslaved laborers to be forced to work in the mines was a common enough phenomenon that we have several extant examples mentioning rich Athenians leasing out up to 1,000 enslaved workers to miners. Working in a mine as a free person would presumably have been an absolute last resort due to the extremely heavy and dangerous nature of the work. In Roman times, being condemned to the mines was the second harshest punishment after the death penalty. Scholarly representations of workers in the Laurion mines tend to picture the workforce as consisting of exclusively adult men, but the sources point to a different reality. Preserved footprints at the entrance to some of the Laurion shafts show the presence of children around the mines. The fact that many of the tunnels connecting the underground extraction galleries are so narrow that adults are only able to move through them crawling on their knees or even on their stomach suggests that children were present also inside the mine. So here you see how narrow these tunnels are. And this is not an exception. This is a very common size for the tunnels. One of the only extant written descriptions of the conditions in an ancient mine comes to us from the 1st century BCE Greek historian Diodorus Siculus. He describes the lives of enslaved children in a gold mine in Egypt. Quote, "The children there who have not yet come to maturity, entering through the tunnels into the galleries formed by the removal of the rock, laboriously gather up the rock as it is cast down piece by piece and carried out into the open to the place outside the entrance." Lead, and hence also galena, has a very high density. It's almost as heavy as gold, and transporting the ore would have been a heavy task to perform. One of the richest bodies of archaeological and epigraphical evidence of child labor in ancient mines come from Roman lead and silver mines in Rio Tinto in today's Spain. So these mines here. That had their peak between the 2nd century BCE and 2nd century CE. There too, modern Spanish miners coming across ancient mining shafts and galleries have suggested that child labor must have been used to move ore around in the mines, judging by the extremely small size of the spaces connecting extraction galleries. Child-sized baskets found in the mines support their observations. It has also been suggested that due to their size, children would have been tasked with exploring and opening up new areas of the mine. In an extraction gallery in Rio Tinto, the remains of 2 circa 10-year-old individuals were uncovered. Nearby, a set of mining tools were found that included a small pickaxe. The head is only 16 centimeters long, and weighs less than 400 grams. So appropriate for a child, if you can say that such a tool is appropriate for a child. This indicates that children were not only forced to transport the ore, but also to work on dislodging it from the mine face. This evidence has been used to argue that being tasked with extracting ore from the mine face would have allowed children to play an important and active role in the mine and in its creation, and that the practice shows an appreciation of the skill of the miners, of the children as miners. However, I would also add that exploring new parts of the mine would have been a dangerous and potentially stressful responsibility to shoulder. The Laurion bedrock partly consists of very hard marble stone, and even with a small pickaxe, the work would have been extremely difficult. Diodorus Siculus also describes women working in the mining industry. After the children have brought the ore to the surface, Diodorus goes on describing the following steps in the processing of the ore. Quote, "Thereupon the women and older men received from them the rock of this size and cast it into mills, of which a number stand there in a row. And taking their places in groups of 2 or 3 at the spoke of or handle of each mill, they grind it until they have worked down the amount given them to the consistency of the finest flour." End quote. Based on historical sources, it seems that elite ideals in classical Athenian society were negative towards working women, but there is also a substantial amount of evidence that speak to it in reality being quite common for women to work, including in fields requiring heavy physical labor, such as metalworking and pottery manufacturing. Washing and fulling were other physically demanding fields of work that were often performed by women. The fact that women and children have been found buried in graves connected to the mining town Torikos in Laurion and to ore processing facilities in the area has been interpreted as evidence of male miners being accompanied by families. But considering the multiple sources pointing to both children and women being forced to work in the mines, I argue that women and children buried in Laurion would have been part of the enslaved workforce rather than just accompanying family members of male mine workers. The evidence surveyed so far suggests a division of tasks based on gender and age, with younger men and children working inside the mines, and women and older men working in the processing facilities outside the mines. Dividing mining tasks based on age and gender was not only done in Greek mines. Research on human remains from ancient salt mines in Hallstatt in today's Austria show that, and this is cemeteries, material from cemeteries that date to the first millennium BCE, show that while men had injuries related to striking movements, women had injuries related to lifting movements, and children had injuries from carrying heavy loads. In the Hallstatt mines, the size of leather shoes and head coverings also indicate the presence of not only children and youths, but babies in the mines. For caretakers who were forced to work long shifts in the mines, bringing their small children with them underground might have been the only possibility to ensure their survival. To return to Greece, the evidence that I have laid out here can be compared to this Greek 6th century votive tablet, depicting mining of either ore or clay. The person collecting materials on the ground and the person receiving a basket outside the mine lack a beard and are smaller compared to the 2 others, perhaps indicating that they are youths or children. Or the person receiving the basket outside the mine could possibly be interpreted as a woman, but damage in the crotch area makes this hard to determine. While it was unusual that women were depicted naked in ancient Greek art, enslaved or otherwise oppressed women could be shown in the nude. So now we know a bit about who was working in the mines, but what exactly would they have been doing? Cuttings in the walls of the Laurion mining shafts show that there would have been wooden scaffolding put in place to be used as stairs when entering and exiting the mine. Traces in stone blocks around the openings show that ropes would have been used to lower tools and other resources down into the mine and to hoist things out again. Once inside the mine, an arduous and uncomfortable underground trek through narrow tunnels awaited the enslaved workers. Once they had reached their spot, they would have started dislodging the ore using iron hammers, pointed picks, pickaxes, and crowbars. From Spain and Austria, where the conditions for the survival of iron and organic materials are better, come additional evidence of ancient mining tools, such as chisels, tongs, adze, I don't know how to pronounce this word, adzes, hoes, forks, and wooden shovels. Other workers would be collecting the loosened ore using hoes and shovels. Then the children tasked with transporting ore out of the mine would take over. The narrow tunnels in the Laurion mine would have made bags or baskets difficult to carry through these, like from the extraction gallery to the opening. But from the ancient salt mines in Hallstatt comes evidence of transport cloths with or without carrying sticks being used. And traces in mining galleries in Laurion, I think they were actually here, you see this kind of trace, show evidence of heavy materials being dragged across the floor. So one option would have been to load ore onto cloths and then drag them through the tunnels, perhaps bundling them up and slinging them over the shoulder where space permitted it. After the child had dragged or carried the ore to the appropriate shaft, it was hauled out of the mine, probably using ropes and pulleys, which we have evidence of from ancient mines on Cyprus. In order to see what they were doing and where they were going, the workers in the mine would have needed light. The most common lighting utensil in ancient Greece was the earthenware lamp filled with some kind of fat, often olive oil, and lit with a wick. While their small size made the standard lamps easy to carry around, they would not have lasted for a very long time before needing to be refilled. In Laurion, there are niches cut into the walls of the mines where lamps of a size that allowed for up to 10 hours of light could have been placed. Another lighting option would have been torches, either hung on the walls or held in the hand. Diodorus Siculus mentions miners with lamps strapped to their forehead, but I have not been able to find any archaeological evidence that supports this, at least not yet. I have not stopped looking. No matter what kind of lighting devices they would have used, both lamps and torches would have required a steady supply of either fat and wicks or wood. They would also have competed with the workers for the oxygen resources, which, due to limited ventilation, were already scant. The need for light might also have given rise to specific tasks in the mine. From Hallstatt, again the salt mines in Austria, comes evidence of fire stations where embers were kept alive in order to ensure continuous access to fire. Such stations might have made working possible for people who were unable to perform more strenuous tasks in the mines due to disabilities, injuries, or age. Other tasks that were related to lighting that would have been less physically demanding than many other mining tasks may have included carrying or holding torches and moving around the mine minding torches or refilling lamps. In addition to tools and light, the miners would also have brought with them something to drink and maybe other sustenance into the mine. From Spain, we have examples of amphoras that could have contained water or wine, with workers carrying personal bottles made out of pitch-lined grass. Traces of meals taken by workers deep in the mines come in the form of wooden bowls found in ancient copper mines on Cyprus. Extensive bioarchaeological studies on human remains from the Laurion area have not yet been carried out, but a small sample of 2 young women and 2 young men from a 5th century BCE cemetery in one of the main centers in Laurion showed no difference in the quality of diet when compared to populations from 2 urban cemeteries in Athens. Long shifts underground would also have come with the need for the miners to relieve themselves. Evidence from the Dürnberg salt mines, also in modern Austria, suggests that certain areas could have been designated as latrines. The underground galleries in the Dürnberg mines, however, are much larger than the ones at Laurion, and in the Laurion mines, using buckets or some form of chamber pots might have been more feasible. Another potential addition to the assemblage that we see emerging inside the mine would have been different forms of protective gear. From Roman mines come evidence of sandals, helmets, and knee pads made from brass, and from Dürnberg we have shoes and caps made of leather. The 1st century CE Roman natural philosopher Pliny the Elder tells us that animal bladders were sometimes used as face masks. Quote, persons polishing cinnabar in workshops tie on their face loose masks of bladder skin to prevent their inhaling the dust in breathing, which is very pernicious, and to allow them to see over the bladders. Both archaeological and literary sources indicate that enslaved mine workers would have been shackled or otherwise chained up. While archaeological evidence of shackles from the ancient world is extremely rare due to recycling of metal and the low survival rate of iron, some of the very few archaeological examples that we do have come from mining contexts. One is from Kalaureia in the Laurion district, which you see here on the screen. A second is from a Roman mine in La Fortuna in Spain. In both of these cases, human remains shackled with iron fetters were found inside the mine. I argue that the fact that these shackles both were found preserved together with human remains offer another explanation as to why archaeological evidence of shackles in mines is so rare if they were widely used. The enslaved worker would have had to die inside the mine without anyone removing the body, or just the shackles, for archaeologists to have a chance of finding them. In most cases, the shackles would probably have left the mine either together with the person wearing them or with the overseer. This material evidence of shackling workers is supported by a 5th century black figure culex, or cup, from Campania in Italy. On the interior of the culex a person is depicted carrying a bucket and wearing shackles around his ankles. The shackles from Kalaureia are exactly the same model as the ones depicted on the cup, a model that would still have allowed for some movement while making fleeing very difficult. Ancient literary sources also attest to the practice of keeping miners shackled while working. Diodorus Siculus says that the miners in Egypt were kept in chains, and the Greek 1st to 2nd century CE philosopher Plutarch states that, quote, the working of mines cannot be highly regarded, since most of it is carried on by employing malefactors or barbarians, some of whom are kept in chains and done to death in damp and unwholesome places. An argument that researchers today quite often bring against these sources is that shackles would have restricted the movement of the worker too much. But based on the sources that we do have, I argue that we have to seriously consider the possibility of this practice. The actions that were needed to loosen ore from the bedrock, swinging a pickaxe or a hammer, would not necessarily have been hindered completely by having the feet shackled. On the contrary, it might have been preferred by the enslaver or by the overseer as a way to ensure that the enslaved worker stayed put or that they didn't turn their tools into weapons. While the work of transporting the ore from the mine face to the exit would probably have been hindered by shackles, fear of flight might have been another reason for using young children for this task, if it was assumed that they would be less likely to dare to attempt to escape. The access to tools, light, sustenance, and protective gear would not have been the same for all workers in the mine, and practices of confinement might have varied between mines or between groups of workers. The fact that the protective gear at least partly seemed to have had an improvised character suggests that this was not something the owner or leaser would have supplied to the workers. But on the other hand, contracts regarding leasing of enslaved workers for mining sometimes featured clauses that stated that new enslaved workers had to be supplied in cases where a worker died. So it might have been in the interest of the mine worker or the overseer to keep the workers at least alive and preferably able to work. Not only does this suggest that people at the time were aware of the dangers of working in the mines, it also tells us about the social position of enslaved people in Greek society. The people who leased allotments in Laurion knew what fate they were condemning their enslaved workers to when they ordered them to the mines, but valued the economic gain higher than the lives of the workers. It was not only the physical labor that could damage the body of the Laurion mine worker. In addition to the ever-present danger of collapse, mining also carries the risk of releasing toxic gases trapped in the bedrock. Bad lighting can cause nystagmus, which leads to partial or total blindness, and exposure to mineral dust can cause lung infections. In the case of lead mining, as I mentioned in the beginning, we have to add the fact that lead is toxic to humans and especially dangerous when inhaled. At each step of the mining and the processing of the ore, the workers would not only have been forced to perform heavy physical labor, they would also have been exposed to lead dust and fumes. The smelting of galena is especially risky. In addition to spreading lead pollution, which can be traced through ice cores from Greenland, there was a almost as high peak of lead pollution during ancient times as we have today during modern times. It releases sulfur dioxide, which already Pliny the Elder pointed out is, quote, dangerous to all animals, end quote. Lead, when it enters the body, affects every organ, and the symptoms of lead poisoning include abdominal pain, nausea, and other gastrointestinal issues, high blood pressure, anemia, kidney failure, seizures, and infertility. Because lead can also cross the blood-brain barrier, it also causes developmental disabilities, as well as other neurological issues such as insomnia, delirium, and hallucinations. As lead accumulates in the body over time, the symptoms worsen and often ultimately lead to death. As already mentioned, larger bioarchaeological studies on materials from Laurion still remain to be done, but a recent study that featured a very small sample of human remains from a Laurion cemetery, I think just 2 individuals, showed significantly higher levels of lead in the Laurion sample compared to samples from other ancient Greek sites. A group of enslaved workers approaching the entrance of a mine would have consisted of several different identities. The workers could have been children, youths, or adults of different ages and genders. They could have been born into slavery or recently enslaved. Some of them might have been seasoned miners with sharply developed skills, while others might have been about to enter the mine for the first time. For some, especially among the children and youths, it might be the first day of transitioning from one task to another. Some, if not all, would have been experiencing physical pain induced by both hard repetitive labor and long-term exposure to lead, as well as mental strain due to stress, fear, and grief. Some would be chained up and forced to work, while others would be tasked with overseeing them. In many cases, overseeing would have meant exerting violence against others, as whipping was the established way of managing enslaved people in ancient Greece. Ahead of the workers lay hours of being confined to a small dark space where the conditions of their survival were not only set by their overseer, but by their own physical capabilities in interaction with the capabilities of their tools and the surrounding bedrock. Theodorus Siculus gives us a vivid summary of the lives of enslaved gold miners in Egypt in the 2nd century BCE, lives that would not have been that different from those of the enslaved Laurion miners. Quote, "And since no opportunity is afforded any of them to care for his body, and they have no garment to cover their shame, no man can look upon the unfortunate wretches without feeling pity for them, because of the exceeding hardships they suffer. For no leniency or respite of any kind is given to any man who is sick or maimed or aged, or in the case of a woman for her illness. But all without exception are compelled by blows to persevere in their labors until through ill treatment they die in the midst of their tortures. Consequently, the poor unfortunates believe, because their punishment is so excessively severe, that the future will always be more terrible than the present, and therefore look forward to death as more to be desired than life." So we have now gone through the process of mining the lead ore and arrive at the start of the next step in the itinerary, the processing of the ore into metallic lead, which will also get its own chapter in the dissertation. Following the flow of the lead used to repair pots and poros back to its origin in the mine has allowed me to make visible some of the people and some of the work that the repairs from ancient Kalaureia preserve the traces of. In the limited underground space of the mine, an assemblage emerges that encompasses the mine and its lead-bearing geology, the various resources and tools, the free and enslaved workers of different status, and the hierarchies and solidarities connecting them. With each part of the assemblage being, as Karen Barad puts it, an, quote, active participant in the world's becoming, end quote, the reality is created that will bring the lead to Calabria. What I have outlined here is only part of the itinerary that took the lead from the mine to Calabria. Each part of this itinerary would have emerged out of the various assemblages that the lead flowed into and out of along the way. Archaeological and literary evidence of men, women, and children being involved in the mining process highlights the necessity of an intersectional approach, while new materialist interventions show that in order to fully understand the lived experiences of the past, we cannot only consider the human agents involved. What I hope that I've shown here today is that even something as small and unassuming as a piece of lead used to mend a pot at any given site can be used to look at slavery in ancient Greece at large. It is often argued in Greek archaeology that it is impossible for archaeologists to identify traces of slavery in the archaeological record unless we find an object that unambiguously point to the presence of enslaved people and only enslaved people. I instead argue that in a society where enslaved labor was used in all aspects of life and society, there are no parts of the archaeological record that does not point to the forced labor that went into creating it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I hope you'll, I think you can look for raised hands, maybe Sarah, or in the chat. People can ask questions in the chat. That might be good. Anyway, that was really very, very engaging and stunning, and bringing a lot of different data together to get back to Greece. So, you know, one forgets about children, but you brought them to the fore. So I appreciate that. But please continue with your questions. Thank you.
I can ask a question.
Yes.
Hi, Sarah.
Hi.
That was great. Thank you so much. The amount of information you presented about the entire mining sequence was really interesting. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the sanctuary context of the material that you're considering and how you envision enslaved people operating specifically within that context, and how it might have been different from other types of enslaved experiences.
Yeah, so the assemblage, thank you for the question. The assemblage is a bit tricky in that sense. It's kind of found on the border. It's like just outside the walls of the sanctuary. So it could come from either inside the sanctuary or from this settlement that grew up around the sanctuary. So I'm going to kind of consider both. When it comes to the sanctuary in Greece, there's the interesting opportunity of temple slaves or enslaved people being like working and living specifically in sanctuaries. And we know from sources that just as many sanctuaries, Calabria was known as a place of refuge during antiquity. The most famous person is Demosthenes, who fled to Calabria and sought asylum, and then also took his own life there. So there I have to consider the option, because one that enslaved people would have had the opportunity to flee, to come to this sanctuary, ask for asylum, and become not free, but stay enslaved within the sanctuary instead, and how this would have differed from being, and then contrast that with being enslaved in more household contexts or more like mercantile or workshop contexts in the settlement around the sanctuary. But these were also very interwoven. The sanctuary, at least this is the theory that we have about the site, is that this sanctuary, the settlement kind of existed in order to keep the sanctuary running, as did a lot of agriculture on the island. So then we also like bring in the potential of enslaved people working in agriculture on the island that serves this sanctuary. So there's like a lot of different experiences there that I want to try to think through, and how that would have, what difference that would have made. Hope that answers a little bit. Yeah, Cheska.
Yeah, thank you so much for this. It's very interesting and exciting. And, I'm working kind of on the Roman side of some similar things, but different. But I was so struck by your mention of babies being in these spaces. And I'm also thinking a lot about people like to say that mining is like unskilled labor. But I think that's really not true. And you brought out there's a lot of complications in the process. I'm thinking about this kind of the knowledge, not just the babies and children being there as this kind of, they're forced there. There's this, they're dragged along as a family, but also as a kind of, community of learning and figuring out how to do these things. And it's kind of complicated by the health problems associated with lead, but I just wondered if you had any thoughts about that aspect of it.
Yeah, I was also really struck. So these salt mines are absolutely incredible sources for really daily life in ancient mining, because the salt obviously preserves organic material really, really well. I think a lot about this, like how so that, yeah, these kind of like different experiences, because you would have had people coming in who were recently enslaved and sent to the mines, who might have been a free person doing something completely different before that, or you would have had people who were born into it and grew up potentially starting out with like tasks that the youngest children would have done. For example, minding babies could have been one such task. And then kind of learning more and more and transitioning from one task to another. And I think a lot about how I have to be careful to not to what does it mean to go from one task to another? Because of course there can be the feeling of pride that you have learned a new skill. Maybe you get to transition to a group of older people who have more responsibility. But then the other side of that is that might mean harder tasks to do, more heavy labor. It can mean scarier tasks. It could come, like, this transition can also come with stress. And it can mean going from being the oldest, most skilled, most seasoned in the youngest group to being the youngest, newest person in an older group, which might also be quite a disruptive experience. So these are things I'm trying to think through when I think about children and learning through moving through different tasks in the mines. Yes, Susanna.
Hello, and thank you. It's amazing to hear what you've been up to. Forgive me for asking a question about a literary source when you've done such an excellent job with the physical materiality side of things. Who is leasing 1,000 slaves at a time to these mining enterprises?
It's the rich guy who did all the outrageous things, Nicias. It's from Plutarch's Lives of Nicias. So Nicias was a very rich Athenian and got partly through mining, partly through leasing out enslaved workers to the mining industry, got extremely rich. So it's both, he kind of, through this telling of his life, we have some of the extreme data from the mining industry. So it's both that he leases out 1,000 miners in one go, and we have the most expensive enslaved person recorded from antiquity is a seasoned, very experienced enslaved overseer, mining overseer that Nikias buys. So, and I think that's also interesting to think about when we think about different social status within the groups working in the mine. That also, it was not as simple as enslaved or free, that also within these groups, you would have had very different social status and different relationships to each other. So yeah, that's the source for that. But it's, I mean, not everything. So Laurion is a very big area, and it's absolutely littered with bigger and smaller mines. So there would also, Nikias it's often the exceptions that have survived. So that also gives a bit of a skewed picture. So the common assumption is that there would also have been a lot of much, much smaller mining operations, maybe even some with like 1 or 2 enslaved workers, and maybe smaller groups working together, kind of coming together in cooperatives.
I have another thought as well, I guess.
Yes.
The child-sized pickaxes is a mental image that will stick with me forever, but that certainly points to the substantial like secondary infrastructure that would have had to be present to support all of this. So, the blacksmith who's making the tools, because it's hard to imagine you can just buy that at a non-mining facility or what have you. Are there any traces in the excavations further outside of the mines of where these people might have been housed or any of that?
Yeah, so that's one of the things I want to do in the dissertation, and then even more in the book that I hope to develop the dissertation into, is really reevaluate the excavation that has been done because there's a lot of settlements, more domestic settlements in Laurion, that also a lot of these processing facilities seem to have been kind of half domestic, half processing workshops. But because the dominant thought in the research on this and in the archaeological reports is that any evidence of domestic life of women and children would have had nothing to do with mining work or any work at all, and would just have been nicely accompanying families. I think there's a need to look at this data again and think about it from like the perspective of all members of these households being in different ways. Because like you say, this mining, it's like the tools are needed. You need a ton of water for the processing. You need a ton of firewood for the smelting. So Laurion used to be a very wooded area once upon a time, and today it's absolutely bare because so much wood was used for the smelting. Also, just all the, like I said, it's not an area where you can do a lot of agriculture. So also the amount of food that would have been needed to be brought in. So I kind of, in my head, is this kind of like ever expanding network. Each thing that I brings with it its own network of tasks that had to be done. And while I won't be able to go like document each network, what I want to show is that each of these networks would have been heavily reliant on enslaved labor. And I think that for each of them, there are a ton of archaeology. Basically, all archaeological traces are also traces of the enslaved labor that kept these networks going. So I think it's more a question of which angle we think about it from than if we have evidence or not. Pascal.
Hey, Sara, it's so nice to see you.
You too.
Just as a side. I thought your talk was amazing, and I especially love the title of your talk, actually. I thought was brilliant. And I enjoy all of these questions and learning more about enslavement in ancient Greece, which isn't something that I know a whole lot about. So I appreciate your talk and all the questions. I actually wanted to go back to the very beginning of your talk when you take us to your field site and you start talking about your experience excavating and what happens when you encounter a piece of lead, which I thought was brilliant. And I wanted to know what happens to it after. We sort of leave it in a plastic bag full of holes, and I'm curious, where does it go from there? And I'm sort of interested, excuse me, in what might be a consequence of highlighting them in this way and sort of connecting these pieces of lead you uncover to other materials that have traces of lead in the repair process.
Yeah, thank you. So that's also something that I really want to, I think that's gonna have to be like the next step of the dissertation, because part of the problem is that not much happens after that. That's kind of where they often get left. They end up in a storage and sit there until some graduate student comes along and is like, oh, this is interesting. So part of why I like one of the very first times I excavated, I ended up digging through what we thought was it was also on Poros. We thought it was a tile collapse, and it turned out that I was sitting inside the base of a giant pithos, a giant storage vessel, and this base looked like it was made by Dr. Frankenstein. It's an absolute crisscross puzzle of lead mendings. And I was very curious. Everybody was just like, yeah, it's like they did this. And I had a ton of questions and there were no answers. And then later on in the season, it rained and we had to empty this repaired base with buckets because it's still perfectly held water. So this is kind of where my fascination with this started, because clearly this was a very advanced repair process. So what I would like to do, which I haven't had the possibility to do for the dissertation, is to look, like I go into as much as I can into the process of repairing and how it was done, but I'd like to do XRF studies on the lead mendings to be able to say with more precision where they come from or if they are mixes, and to study them with RTI photography to potentially see traces, like very minute traces of how they, because we don't actually really know. There's a lot of theories of how they were done with molds or just pressing, and there's also clearly different methods, some more skilled and some less skilled. So I would like to think of different ways of using different imaging technologies to study the surface of these lead mendings, to see what we could say about them, precisely to think a bit more like to give the repairs the focus I think they deserve. And for the book, like where I would like to take this, in the dissertation, I focus on the lead repairs and I follow the lead. I take this one material and I trace it. But for me, it's really about the lead being part of an assemblage where we have the lead, we have the ceramic vessel, and we have what was in the vessel. So I would like to study these parts together and see how they come together, what they do to each other, how these pots would have been used, and like, because lead is toxic, it leaches out into, depending on if the material inside the pot, for example, is acidic or not. There's all these factors that would have gone into like what the lead repairs did with the pots. So that's something I would love to kind of trace all these three materials together.
Thank you. It's such an exciting project.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions for Sara? Okay, Sara, there's some lovely comments in the chat. Just thank you for your talk. And we'd like to thank you so much for speaking today. This was fascinating. And thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you all for coming, for listening. This was great.
Bye-bye. Thanks.